This week, veteran SNP MSP Fergus Ewing voted against his own government when he refused to support Humza Yousaf's decision to back Green Minister Lorna Slater in a vote of no confidence. There are reports that he's going to sack Fergus Ewing because of this. Is he?
First Minister.
Well, I'm not going to go into issues that are matters for our group. What I will say to Douglas Ross is I'm not going to take any lectures on leadership from Douglas Ross. Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who just this week was unable to muster his own Scottish Tory MPs to vote to sanction Boris Johnson. He says, Douglas Ross says they did. Of course, the soon-to-be Lord Jack did not. So let's be honest, Douglas Ross isn't the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, it is the Cabinet's man in Scotland, Alistair Jack.
Douglas Ross.
Well, let's start in a number of areas. This is a government issue because it was a government vote of no confidence in a government minister. And surely Humza Yousaf can be honest with the people across Scotland if he takes it seriously that one of his own MSPs refused to support him. Because on the day that farmers and crofters all over Scotland come to Edinburgh for the start of the Highland Show, the First Minister is reported to be considering sacrificing a former Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and one of the longest-serving SNP MSPs for a Green Minister who has failed time and time again. Fergus Ewing backed a Scottish Conservative vote of no confidence in the Green Minister Lorna Slater because of her dreadful performance in post, especially the disastrous handling of the deposit return scheme, which has cost businesses time and money and has completely flopped. For Green support, he's sacrificing Fergus Ewing, the son of Winnie Ewing, one of the SNP's most famous representatives.
Members, let's have orderly conduct,
We've gone from Stop the World, the SNP wants to get on, to Stop the SNP, Fergus Ewing is getting off. So why is he considering losing a party stalwart who is standing up for Scottish businesses while keeping an incompetent Green Minister who has lost their confidence?
First Minister.
Can I just remind Douglas Ross, of course, that this Parliament voted to back Lorna Slater and this government when it came to that vote of no confidence. And I'll tell you why they did that, Presiding Officer. They did that because the deposit return scheme was not sabotaged.
First Minister. Excuse me, Mr Hoy. Can I ask all members who feel compelled to intervene any time a member is asking or responding to a question to cease? We will conduct our proceedings in an orderly manner as required by our standing orders. First Minister.
The reason why they don't want to hear this, Presiding Officer, is because the blame squarely lies with the UK Government when it comes to the sabotaging of the deposit return scheme. The reason why this Parliament backed this Government, backed Lorna Slater when it came to that vote of no confidence, is because they know that it was the UK Government's 11th hour intervention that completely torpedoed the deposit return scheme. What have we seen from the UK Government? What have we seen from Douglas Ross when it comes to that deposit return scheme? We have seen more flip-flopping from Douglas Ross on the deposit return scheme. He stood not on one manifesto, but on two manifestos to include glass within the deposit return scheme. But of course, when Alistair Jack gets involved, suddenly Douglas Ross changes his tune. And how dare he talk about the impact on farmers when it is the hard Brexit imposed by the UK Government that has caused such damage to our farmers up and down this country. You don't have to take my word for it, Presiding Officer. You can take the NFU Scotland's word for it. The President of the NFU Scotland, Martin Kennedy, and I'll quote him directly, he said, "The Brexit dividend certainly hasn't come about at all. And all the things that we were concerned about, the whole reason that we backed Remain at the time, they've all come to fruition." So perhaps Douglas Ross, if he doesn't want to listen to me, should listen to the farmers of this country.
Douglas Ross.
I'd love
Thank you.
I'd love to listen to Humza Yousaf actually giving an answer to a question. There are serious questions to be raised about the conduct of one of his MSPs who has voted against his own government on a vote of no confidence. So if he says it was a right decision to back Lorna Slater, what does that say about Fergus Ewing? Humza Yousaf, the First Minister who won't suspend Nicola Sturgeon, who's under police investigation, looks like he will suspend Fergus Ewing for challenging Green incompetence. Now, the First Minister has also said this deal with the Greens is worth its weight in gold. But then he quoted NFU Scotland. So let me do the same. At 10:50 this morning, from the Highland Show, so just over an hour ago, the National Farmers Union of Scotland highlighted their concerns with the Nationalist pact with the Greens. They warned, and this is a quote from NFU President Martin Kennedy, "Hardening of the Green agenda is giving cause for serious concern, not only for rural businesses, but for the Scottish economy as a whole." Not my words, the words of the NFU President in Scotland. He went on to say they doubt very much that solutions to key rural issues will be possible while the Butte House Agreement continues. So in the week of the Royal Highland Show, Scotland's biggest agricultural event, doesn't this show that the SNP has abandoned rural Scotland?
First Minister.
We, of course, the SNP, represent most of rural Scotland, presiding officer. So let's leave that to the verdict of the Scottish...
Thank you, members.
And I'll tell you, we were talking about a recycling scheme a moment ago. Thank goodness that brass can be recycled, because there's plenty of brass neck from Douglas Ross when he talks about conduct of parliamentarians. For the leader of the Scottish Conservatives to talk about conduct of parliamentarians after Boris Johnson has just been sanctioned this very week shows an incredible level of hypocrisy, presiding officer.
Members, you will be aware of the requirement to conduct yourselves in an orderly manner, and I'd be grateful if people could reflect on how they are behaving at this moment. People have gathered here to hear and listen to questions and responses. First Minister.
They don't want to listen. Listen how they bark in defence of Boris Johnson whenever he's mentioned, presiding officer. Let me also say, when it comes to rural Scotland, is it simply a fact that the Conservatives have completely betrayed rural Scotland because of their hard Brexit imposed upon them. And that is why, for example, the Conservatives won't back our sensible plans for a rural visa pilot. That would help our agriculture community, our sector, our farmers up and down this country who, again, are suffering because of that hard Brexit being imposed by Douglas Ross's Conservatives. And in terms of helping rural Scotland, assisting rural Scotland as best we possibly can, we know that rural Scotland are also suffering the consequences of that Tory cost of living crisis. We know high energy costs, we know high inflation costs have all hit agricultural Scotland hard, and that's why we provided support for community-led development, including £11.6 million in 22-23 to over 300 community-led projects, strengthening resilience and sustainability of grassroots rural community groups. So yes, I will continue to show leadership, not just in terms of my party, but in terms of this country and protecting it from the harm and the misery and, frankly, the cruelty of Conservative UK governments.
Douglas Ross.
It's all just deflection and spin from this useless First Minister. Questions about Fergus Ewing are answered with Boris Johnson.
Mr Ross,
questions
Mr Ross, let's conduct our business with courtesy and respect.
Well, I think it's perfectly respectful. I think anyone viewing the 3 attempted answers by the First Minister there will reach the same conclusion as I have. Because questions about Fergus Ewing and an SNP MSP are responded to with answers about Boris Johnson, and then the First Minister stands up to quote the President of NFU Scotland, not realising what he said at the Highland Show this morning and the damning assessment of his government and the SNP Green Coalition government from Martin Kennedy, from Scotland's farmers and crofters. I hope when the First Minister does visit the Highland Show this week, he will listen to Scotland's farming representatives and what they think about his government. Because it is clearer than ever before that the green tail is wagging the SNP dog. The extremist Greens in government seem to be calling an awful lot of the shots of this SNP government. Their influence is having a damaging effect on every policy area. On deposit return scheme, they're risking jobs and businesses. On farming, they're risking rural livelihoods. On gender reform, they're risking women's rights. On fishing, they're risking the very future of this industry. On oil and gas, they're risking Scotland's energy security. The SNP are so out of touch with mainstream Scotland because they are being dragged that way by the Scottish Greens. So just why is Humza Yousaf, in the words of one of his other MSPs, dancing to the tune of an extremist party?
First Minister.
I'm being accused of being out of touch by the leader of the third party in Scotland, Douglas Ross. When he took over the mantle, of course, of leadership, his party was in second place. He's managed to lead them into third place, presiding officer. So I'm hardly going to take any lectures whatsoever on leadership from Douglas Ross. And let me just talk to some of the issues.
First Minister, we will hear the First Minister. Please continue.
Let me just talk to some of the issues that Douglas Ross has mentioned. He's mentioned the Deposit Return Scheme. He's mentioned, of course, the Gender Reform Recognition Act. And, of course, in a number of areas, including those two, the Conservatives have done nothing but allow their colleagues in Westminster to undermine this Parliament, undermine devolution, and that is hardly a surprise from the party presiding officer that opposed the creation of the Scottish Parliament in the very first place. And Douglas Ross asks why we're in a cooperation agreement with the Greens. We are in that cooperation agreement because I do think people want different political parties, and yes, the SNP and the Greens do have differences, coming together to work in the national interest. But why else is that cooperation agreement so important? Because the number one issue facing not just Scotland, but the entire planet is the climate emergency that threatens the sustainability of our planet. And time again, presiding officer, when we bring forward action to tackle that climate emergency, where are the Conservatives? They oppose every single measure. And why do they oppose every single measure? Because, frankly, presiding officer, they are morphing into climate change deniers.